Once More with Feeling by Wetpretzel. Read by Alex Mabello. Chapter 10. Can't Malfoy just make his own lunches? Ron grumbled after casting a quick healing charm on his finger that he had nicked with the potato peeler. Better yet, can't you just eat this for yourself? Hermione scowled at him, reaching over to check his finger, perfectly healed. He must have had plenty of practice in the field. She tried not to focus too much on the distress that thought brought her. It's called a grand gesture, Ronald. She huffed and nudged him out of the way to take over peeling the potatoes. Ron mumbled something unintelligibly and leaned down to squint at the recipe. Merlin knows how our professors were able to mock your essays, Hermione. I reckon your handwriting's worse than mine. Hermione sent him a warning glare. Don't forget to salt the water. You know, when you said you needed my help with something, this isn't what I had in mind. Ron whined, carelessly tossing the teaspoon of salt into the boiling pot. This is my 2-week leave, Hermione. I'm supposed to be relaxing, not bloody cooking Malfoy's lunches. Well, like you said, you're on leave, so it's not like you had anything better to do. Hermione said lightly, scooping the potato peels to the side of the chopping board. It was Ron's turn to scowl at her, and she snorted. Besides, you were raised by Molly Weasley. I'm sure you've managed to pick up something other than sausage links, she finished with a wry grin. Ron's ears flashed at her light GB. Doesn't mean I have to use that skill for Malfoy, he said as he reached over to check her spice rack. Of course, you have it organized alphabetically. It's the most efficient system. No, not that one. Use the opened one. Hermione said and nodded when he picked up the mostly used paprika shaker. So explain to me how a few lunch boxes are supposed to win you Malfoy back, Ron asked, once they had finished chopping up all of the vegetables a few minutes later. Hermione swallowed, her tongue wetting her lips before she replied, I want to show him that I want to be there for him too, that I'm ready to be with him. She shrugged, her outwards blasé attitude a stark difference to the storm of anxiety that was ravaging in her stomach. We've always cooked together. It's our thing. But I've never taken the step to cook just for him, like he has for me. Hermione looked down at the chopping board, fidgeting with a couple of carrots as the now familiar stab of shame twisted in her spine. And you think this'll work? Ron asked. Her head snapped back up, her eyes wide as she vehemently insisted. It has to. Her chest clenched, her breathing suddenly heavy and shaken, and Hermione's nail dug into her palms painfully. It couldn't not work. She had already wasted so much time moaning over her wounded pride, trying to pretend like being with Draco wasn't one of the best things that had ever happened to her. At the very least, Hermione needed and wanted to prove to Draco just how much she truly cared about him. If, during their time apart, Draco had decided he wanted to move on from her, well, Hermione supposed she deserved it. But she still had to try. It has to, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper, and her eyes squeezed shut. Visions upon visions swarmed her mind, of Draco holding dozens of faceless witches in his arms, looking down at them with that private smile of his, and Hermione had to swallow back a distressed whimper. I can't lose him, Ron. Not after everything I can't! Her sharp panicked gasp cut her off, and she felt Ron's arm quickly wrap around her shoulders, and he squeezed her tightly, reassuringly. You're not going to lose him, Hermione. I reckon Malfoy would sooner chop off his arm than not to be with you. His secret arm, too. That's how much he wants you. Hermione's laugh was muffled against the crook of his shoulder, and she pulled away to smile at him. Thank you for being here, Ron, for doing this. I really am grateful. I know you and Draco aren't exactly best friends. Ron cocked his chin up, a full air of superiority and cockiness. Had he have been blonde, he would have been a dead ringer for Draco in their earlier years at Hogwarts. Hermione's lips pressed together fondly. Yeah, I know, I'm the best. The one who got away and all that, Ron said with a cheeky wink, his hand casually running through his red locks, and he grunted when Hermione lightly slapped his chest. Hermione eyed the pot behind Ron's shoulder, the water dangerously close to boiling over the edge. She reached for a wand and tapped at the stove to bring the pot to a simmer. Time to add the potatoes, she said, and with Ron's help carefully tipped the potatoes into the water. The pair chatted aimlessly over the next half hour, Hermione keeping a cautious eye on the stove. Apparently it was vital that Hermione knew all about the illegal quidditch move that had been pulled by one of the Seekers during the cup final. before she asked Ron about any case that he would have to jump back into when he returned from leave. "Actually, I'm thinking of quitting," Ron said. Hermione whipped her head around and gaped at him. "What?" Ron shrugged, a deep frown marring his boyish feature. "Yeah, I don't know. Don't get me wrong, it's great working with Harry and all that. He's my best mate, and one of my best mates," he added when Hermione coughed pointedly. They grinned at each other, only for a moment, before his expression faded back into resignation. Um, I'm just tired, I guess. Tired of the curses and the shield charms and the bloody paperwork. I was thinking of working with George at his joke shop, maybe. I could do with some more laughter in my life." Hermione nodded. "That'll be good for you. If that's what you really want, you know I'll support you in whatever decision you make." He sent her a half smile and nudged her lightly. "And what about you? Heard you've been ditching your office all week. What, was there another Niffler infestation that forced you out?" He teased and tittered at her. "Aren't you afraid that the magical animal kingdom's falling apart without you there?" "Ha ha," she drawled with an eye roll. "I'll be going back on Monday, but honestly, you've been hounding me to take a break, Ronald." Hermione crossed her arms against her waist and cocked her brow. "What, now I'm not working enough?" The gnawing demon in her chest flared up again, the sea of paperwork that she had abandoned on her desk flooding her mind, and she bit down on her lip harshly in an attempt to distract herself from the that was blooming within her. Hermione knew she couldn't stay away for too much longer, but the fear that she would fall right back into her toxic habits had been lingering over her head for the past couple of days now. Ron's snort interrupted her panicked musings. "Please, you've not even been gone for a full week, Hermione." He looked at her in concern. "Why don't you give it another couple of days, hm?" Hermione looked down at her slippers with a shake of her head, her ankles shuffling together. "This was a big step for me, Ron," she said quietly, "and I genuinely love my job. I need to go back." She stepped towards the stove, spatula in hand, as she absent-mindedly stirred the potatoes. Draco hated when they were overcooked, and she gnawed on her bottom lip again. "Harry thinks I should see your department's mind healer," she said after a few moments. She looked over her shoulder. Ron stepped back at her contemplatively. Do you think that's a good idea?" Ron scanned over her face for a moment in silence before he shrugged, his face blasé with a mild indifference. "It's like I've always said, Miney. You need to sort out your priorities." He grinned after a beat, and Hermione's chest erupted with a surprised laugh. "Check on the chicken, would you?" she asked when their laughter died down, focusing on the recipe. "Yes, I do." Hermione looked back up, frowning in confusion. "What?" "Yes, I think you should see a mind healer," Ron said, and bent down to open the oven. He cursed as hot steam wafted in his face, which flushed as deeply as his hair from the heat. "Oh." She turned back to massage the oil into the chopped vegetable bowl. Chicken is not supposed to still be pink, is it?" He closed the oven tray when she stared at him blankly, and he stood back up. "Look, I'm not saying you've got some unresolved war trauma or something. There's plenty of magic folk who speak with mind healers for much less than that." "I know," she sighed. "There's nothing wrong with speaking to a professional, Miney, and it's better to rule out anything than continue to suffer in silence. Besides, talking with a stranger might be good for you." Ron stepped in beside her and sprinkled more garlic over her fingers. "You know, we're always here to listen if you need us, but there's value in an outsider's perspective too. Someone who doesn't know you like we do, and can just say how they see things, you know. I mean, what's the worst that can happen? At most, you miss an hour away from your desk." He shrugged again. "At least you'll have tried it." Hermione frowned into the mixing bowl and chewed on her lip. "I know it would help me. I mean, at least trying it. That's the thing. I don't. Why am I being so hesitant about this?" "I don't know if you've ever noticed, but you're a bit of a control freak, Miney. It makes sense that you'd have some reservations about talking about your problems with a complete stranger." Ron nudged her lightly. "You want me or Harry to set the appointment up for you?" She shook her head. No, no. If I'm going to go through with this, I need to do it myself. Otherwise, I'll just find an excuse not to go." "Not if I sick Jenny on you, you won't." She puffed out a breathy laugh. "Now there's a scary picture." She paused, looking up at him, and smiled softly. "You really are a good friend, Ron." Ron flicked at the vegetable bowl. "I'm helping my ex-girlfriend woo her boyfriend. Bloody right, I'm a good friend." Hermione snorted, which quickly melted into a full-blown belly laugh, joining Ron. She wiped a humid tear from her eye and grinned at him impishly. Guess which one of Draco's parents has pocket money? Ron's expression glazed over briefly, his brows furrowed, before his eyes widened in shock and then in pure mirth. Who'd have thought your Aunt Lucy needed his wife's permission to enter the Gringotts account? He shook his head and grinned deviously at her. You know I'm going to tell George about this, right? I would be disappointed if you didn't, she smirked. Ron shivered in fine disgust. Bloody hell. You look so much like Malfoy when you do that. I guess couples really do start to resemble each other after a while. Well, then let us hope I never go blonde. According to Mrs. Malfoy, winter colours wash me out something awful, Hermione said dryly. Winter what? What a load of bollocks. He paused to look at her contemplatively. You reckon Malfoy's mum already has your wedding planned? Those lot usually go all out for the big day. Goldendorf, strings band, the Grand Marquet, the lot. Hermione blanched and her ears burned hotly. The memory of Narcissa telling her she would get their family seamstress to hold on to Hermione's measurements came to the forefront of her mind, and her mouth went dry. And Malfoy is always prepared indeed. Ron was silently laughing at her. Her panic must have clearly showed on her face, and she quickly covered it up with a scowl. Please, like I'd ever have doves, she miffed, her stomach treacherously flipping at the image of her in Draco's arms, slow dancing to a strings melody like they had in Greece. Goodness, she hadn't even confessed to Draco yet, and there she was imagining their wedding. She blamed Pansy and the talks of her probably ugly elf-made wedding gown for these silly fantasies. Ron snorted. Yeah, just don't ask me to be a bridesmaid. Hermione tossed a potato peel at his head. Ron left a few hours later, after bombarding Hermione with the news that he was running late for dinner with Luna Lovegood. From what she could gather from his rushed explanation, apparently they had bumped into each other during Beltane, and Ron had been rather taken with her and her conqueror's earrings. At first, Ron had assumed it was due to the crate of butterbeer he had gorged himself on throughout the day, but 3 days later, and he was admittedly a little smitten. Hermione smiled, watching him vanish in the flue flames. After he'd shouted out, "You bloody better not tell Malfoy I help you with this," whilst a rather unorthodox pairing, Hermione couldn't help but think that Luna would be good for Ron. Healing, even. She walked back into her kitchen and set to work, filling up the Tupperware containers and then sealing them with several stasis charms. She then headed back into her living room, looking for her spare parchment and quills. She paused, opening up one of the drawers of her coffee table. Her name stared up at her, sheets upon sheets of discharge papers and prescription notes from St. Mungo's, dating as far back as 4 years ago. She breathed out heavily, her stomach churning. There had to be at least 24 different records in a drawer. Merlin, she thought, as she thumbed through them in disbelief. It seemed like it wasn't just her affections for Draco that Hermione had been in denial over. Had she really convinced herself that working past the point of exhaustion was normal? It was just a sign of her ambition, her dedication to her job, a small price to pay for the greater good? Brightest witch of her age, her ass, Hermione scolded herself, and made a mental note to write the mind healer when she returned to her desk on Monday. Draco had stepped in at the right time, and once again, Hermione was completely enveloped in her gratitude towards him. From him snatching a case from her fingers with a gentle but firm order to go join her friends for lunch, to him all but dragging her to the flue at the end of what he considered to be a reasonable, successful workday, even his jeebies and taunts about her hag-like posture, because he knew she would only grumble and complain about her neck pain when settling down for bed. She really did need him. Even so, Hermione knew that she couldn't keep relying on him. Ginny was right. It wasn't healthy for either of them for her to keep placing that kind of burden on Draco. She remembered how exhausting and draining it had been during the war and their year on the run. Harry's mind slowly being poisoned by the Horcruxes, and Voldemort's further descent into madness. How she would sneak from their tent in the middle of the night to sit and cry at the edge of their wards. How it was her only mental reprieve from being the put-together, focused Hermione that Harry had desperately needed. Yes, Hermione knew all too well how mentally exhausting that was, and shame and guilt churned in her stomach at the thought of placing Draco under a similar burden. She was going to give him the biggest fruit basket he had ever seen when she made things right with him. She did need Draco, and she wanted to need him, but these past few days away from her desk had given her mind soothing clarity that she hadn't felt in the longest time. She could take care of herself. She could take the initiative to step back from everything. and knowing that she did, indeed, still have the control she desperately craved was like a blanket of comfort around her soul. Hermione closed the drawer, a satisfied sigh leaving her, and continued to hunt for a spare parchment, eventually finding it, naturally, in the last drawer she opened. She stared down at the blank page, her bottom lip sore and swollen from the abuse of her teeth as she gnawed over it repeatedly. Hermione couldn't tell him in a letter. As easy as it would be to write down those 3 simple words, he deserved more than a cowardly confession. And yet she knew she had to show something. Something that showed how much she cared for him. Something that showed how she was ready to try things properly. But what? Hermione's eyes stared lost. The empty parchment seemed to taunt her. She huffed in frustration and smacked down her quill onto the coffee table, looking around her living room, hoping that maybe the words she was trying to find would be written somewhere on her walls. The grandfather clock chimed, alerting Hermione that it was 1/2 the hour, and she stared at the swinging pendulum for a few moments before a shadow behind the antique caught her attention. She scowled. Great. The neighbors must have had another pipely. There was damp growing. Her mind screeched to a halt. A damp, cold corner of the Hogwarts library. A hesitant hand creeping for the sleeve of a sleeping classmate. The first time her hand had touched his. A desperate but sincere pleading for him to start looking after himself. Him accepting her biscuit token of compassion. Hermione smiled and looked back down at the parchment, reaching for a quill to quickly scrawl her message. Hermione nudged at her once she finished, and Hermione blinked. Scurrying to her feet and grabbing her note, she rushed back into the kitchen and made for a biscuit tin. Placing another stasis charm on the biscuits, she wrapped them in tin foil and stuck them to the lid of one of the containers, her note carefully laid on top. With a satisfied exhale, Hermione called out for the Malfoy family house elf. Twinkle appeared with a pop, and Crookshanks, who had followed her into the kitchen with a curious and warning expression on his face, hissed, his paw reaching out to bat at the new intruder. Hermione scolded him lightly, carefully nudging him to the side with her foot, and turned to smile at her guest. Hello again, Twinkle." Twinkle stared up at her, her eyes wide and teary. "Good evening, miss. We're so delighted to be in Miss Granger's presence again, miss. We're honoured that you's entrusting us with this task." Twinkle bowed, her nose touching a small stain on the kitchen floor where Ron had accidentally spilled some of the sauce. Yes, thank you, Twinkle, for agreeing to help me with this. You know you don't have to do this, Hermione reminded her. Hermione reminded her kindly, and bent down to lightly nudge the elf up from the floor. Twinkle shook her head and gasped, like Hermione had something positively heinous, which, for a house elf, maybe she had. "No, Miss Granger. We is honoured. We's very happy to be assisting Miss Granger. We will not let you down, miss." Twinkle bowed in her vow, and Hermione sighed lightly. She wondered what the chances were of getting Twinkle to accept the patch of galleons on her side table. At the near desperate, delighted sob Twinkle let out, Hermione imagined it would probably greatly offend the little elf. "Right, well, if you're sure." Hermione nodded when Twinkle practically choked on her agreement, and turned to place the containers in a carrier bag, quickly casting a featherlight charm on it before handing the bag to the eager, grubby hands of the elf. "Can you do me one more favor, Twinkle, and let me know when Draco, Master Malfoy, received these, please?" Twinkle stood upright, her chest expanding in pride as she stared Hermione down determinedly. "We will, miss. We will go to Master Malfoy right away, miss. We will not let you down, miss." Twinkle disappeared with another pop, and Hermione's stomach swooped with bated anticipation. Now all she had to do was wait, and clean and tidy her kitchen. The lift signaled her arrival to her office floor with a ding, and Hermione braced herself for the jarring stop, evidently not well enough, as she stumbled, her shoulders clipping against the wall, and she choked on a groan. She certainly hadn't missed that in her short absence. The lift doors squeaked open, and Hermione's stomach flipped with giddiness as she stepped foot into the corridor. Giddy at the thought of sitting back at her desk, getting to dive back into her case files, the scent of fresh, untouched parchment, and she treated herself to a new ink pot. Peeling the lid off of a new one was always one of Hermione's simple pleasures. And having a mild allergic reaction to the dusty archived cases. Giddy because, oh, buggering hell, She was just excited to see Draco again. More than once Hermione had to tell herself to slow down in her strides as she made her way towards her office, and she just managed to return Matilda's morning greetings as she passed the reception desk. Draco's office appeared in her peripheral vision, and Hermione's skin was electric with anticipation, goosebumps flaring up across her arms, and her navel twisted. She supposed there was no harm in making a quick pit stop. "Good morning, Miss Granger, you're back." Maybe later then. Hermione smiled at her assistant and walked towards her office. "Good morning, Laura. I hope things haven't been too crazy in my absence." Madly smiled, one shoulder shrugging dismissively.
"There was nothing we couldn't handle, but it's good to see you again, miss."
Hermione nodded and stepped over her office threshold. "Just give me an hour to get settled, and then, if you wouldn't mind bringing through my messages."
"Will do, Miss Granger."
Hermione sent her another grateful nod and turned to cross her office. Her jaw dropped as she looked around the room. All giddiness and excitement about returning to work sucked out of her so quickly she felt winded. Her desk was barely visible, to be honest. Papers were stacked as tall as Hermione. They must have been charmed to not topple over, since they curved dangerously over the edge of her desk, and there was a crate of letters and memos nesting in the footwall. All of this was still after her colleagues had covered for her. The amount of fruit baskets she was going to have to send was going to make quite the heavy dent in her bank account, Hermione groaned inwardly. Her eyes squeezed shut. Hermione took several deep inhales. With her shoulder blades pinned back determinedly, she approached her desk, careful not to knock over the tower of folders, and eased into her desk chair. Observing the ocean of paperwork in front of her, Hermione was lost as where to start. She decided to reach for the file closest to her, figuring that Madley had placed them there due to level of importance. Ah, excellent. It appeared Madley had taken the initiative to begin to process Mr. Wilkes' hearing application request. Her initial feelings of being overwhelmed quickly vanished as Hermione set to work. Like riding a bike, she thought. Her mouth was oozing in satisfaction as she placed another completed form to decide for Madley to send off in the mid-morning post. Perhaps a few days off was all she needed. Now that Hermione knew she could always take a few days off from work with no major consequences, the daunting mountain of folders that threatened to bury her aside, maybe she didn't need to speak with a mind healer after all. Hermione had just gotten ahead of herself. She always had a tendency to overthink. It was clearly just a minor case of separation anxiety from her work that had her convincing herself otherwise for the past few days. She just had to remember to take a break once in a while. It was clearly nothing more than that. Hermione knew what she needed to do now to prevent another St. Mungo's fiasco. She didn't need a mind healer to tell her what to do. Hermione was confident that she knew how to control herself now. She would be fine. A brief tap at her door interrupted her thoughts, and her assistant peered through, a hesitant smile on her lips as she gently shook a wet of paper in her hand. "Oh, perfect timing, Laura, thank you." Madeleine approached her desk and handed her a thick bound of memos.
"These are the ones that I and the others didn't have the authority or access to respond to. You don't have any meetings until Wednesday. I figured you would prefer to have a couple of days to, well..."
Madeleine glanced pointedly at the white house practically enveloping Hermione. "Ah, yes, good thinking, Laura."
"Is there anything else I can do for you, Miss Granger?"
she asked, and she reached for the pile of envelopes ready to be posted. She really was a decent assistant. Maybe Hermione should make a recommendation for Madeleine to get a raise. Hermione quickly rummaged through the memos, her heart sinking with each note that passed that didn't have Draco's signature's elegant scrawl. I don't see a message from Mr. Malfoy. Is he back in his office yet?" Hermione hoped that she sounded casual, almost indifferent. The pitied smile her assistant gave her told Hermione that she wasn't entirely successful.
"I'm sorry, Miss Granger. Mr. Malfoy's still up in Cumbria, it seems."
"Oh, right, of course. He must just be out of postal owl range, then." Hermione couldn't suppress a despondent collapse of her shoulders, and her spine curved inwards, her visceral disappointment crushing her.
"Oh, no, I don't think so, miss. Matilda has managed to be in contact with him since last week. She's been receiving updates to pass on to our head of department, so I think he's fine."
It wasn't the comforting words Madeleine had evidently thought it would be, and Hermione's chest hollowed. "Ah," she grinded out thickly.
"Oh, well, I mean, he's quite busy from what I've heard. You know how ferocious these vampire clans can be. Oh, and I'm not being funny or nothing by saying that, but, well, you know."
Madeleine trailed off, her face flushed a deep red. Hermione cocked a brow and smiled thinly. "I'm sure he is." She picked up a pile of papers, tapping them on her desk to straighten up the pages. Well, in any case, I'm sure I'll hear from him when he's got the time. The irony of her words was not lost on her. Medley left shortly after, and Hermione waited for the door to close behind her assistants before she exhaled shakily, her mind racing. Truncle had informed Hermione that Draco had received his lunchboxes and her note, so why hadn't he contacted her? Hermione's chest was tight with panic. Maybe she was too late. Maybe she had taken too long. Maybe he'd spent too many days poisoning himself into a drunk stupor on Parkinson's chaise, and let Pansy fill his head with all of her beliefs that Hermione was toxic, that they were toxic. She wondered how soon she might be able to arrange a portkey to Cumbria. Hermione jumped as a rainfall of letters cascaded from thin air, landing in a messy pile over her hands. She blinked, once, twice, and then a third time, before she laughed, breathlessly. Of course! Did Hermione really expect for Draco to make a move on her through a letter that anyone in her department could easily get their hands on? Hermione all but scowled at her own ridiculousness. How silly of her to get so wound up in her own doubts. This was a personal, private matter between the two of them, after all. If he was going to contact her, of course he would deliver to the privacy of her flat. He knew that she appreciated her privacy. Yes, Hermione was certain that when she returned from work later that evening, there would be an owl waiting for her at her kitchen window. She just had to be patient. A glance at the clock on her wall made her huff out a heavy sigh. She supposed she could wait 8 more hours if she absolutely must. Draco had certainly waited longer. There was no owl waiting for her when she got back to her flat that evening. Flue ash scattered across her living room rug as she sprung from her fireplace in eagerness. And there was still no owl when she finally dragged her feet to her bedroom several hours later, the grandfather clock chiming the arrival of the witching hour behind her. She didn't sleep that night. Her window still showed no postload waiting for her when she entered the kitchen the following morning, nor was there a letter from him at her desk when she arrived at work an hour later. Hermione refused to let the wave of despair swallow her whole again. She couldn't just put her life and her job on hold for a man, and so she reached for a random folder and stuck her head in it. Hours went by, and her head lifted barely an inch from her paperwork. She told herself it was fine to miss lunch. It was fine to ignore Midley's several offers to bring her a cup of tea. It was fine that her head throbbed with a migraine. It was fine that her vision blurred if her eyes scanned across the paperwork too quickly. She was just working hard. Hermione had taken a few days of leave. She had given herself time to rest. She could handle pulling an all-nighter, just this one last time. Hermione paused, her quill dribbling a small pool of ink over her notes. But it wouldn't be the last time, would it? She looked up. A stifled groan lodged in her throat at the pulsing ache of her neck from being hunched over all day, and startled at the moonlight streaming through her windows. She hadn't even noticed the sun setting. And as hard as she tried, Hermione couldn't hear so much as a pin drop from outside her office door. Everyone else had already left for the day. Hermione's chest heaved. She'd done it again. Barely her second day back, and she'd already slipped up. Merlin, what was wrong with her? There is nothing wrong with speaking to a professional. What's the worst that can happen? Ron's words echoed in her mind, and she swallowed thickly. Ron was right. What was the worst that could happen? Anything had to be better than her working herself into early and forced retirement. Lime green robes flashed in her memory, and she breathed heavily. Reaching for a fresh piece of parchment, Hermione scribbled a request to arrange an appointment with the Ministry Mindhealer Department. Hermione barely waited around long enough for the letter to be sent off before she darted off to the lifts, vowing to herself that this was the last time that she would witness the moonlight from her office. Hermione had barely taken a couple of steps out of Gringotts. Mr. Wake's contingency for their new meeting was that Hermione had to go to him, of which she couldn't really argue against, since it had been her fault that she missed the last one, when Theo Nott literally bumped into her. Given her last interaction with Pansy, she couldn't help but wonder if his jostling was purposeful, even as his hands reached out to steady her. His own gait, once again, barely even wavered an inch. The slight coldness of his eyes, marrying his suave smirk, certainly indicated to Hermione that he shared a similar viewpoint of her as his fiancée. Great, round two. Hermione! His voice oozed with fine delight, and she stared at him, her brows furrowed in mild disbelief. They were hardly on well enough terms to be on first-name basis, especially as of late. Not, she said pointedly. Theo grinned, his smile sharp and shark-like. It made the hackles on Hermione's neck rise, and her spine was tight with vexation. "Well, isn't this my lucky day?" he said. "And here I thought I would have to spend my lunch hour alone, with only the finest, honest words of the prophet for company." Hermione couldn't suppress her derisive snort. "I'm sure that's just a regular occurrence for you, Nott." Theo's eyes flashed, the movement too quick for Hermione to pinpoint an exact emotion, and he tilted his head as he pondered at her for a moment. He tucked the newspaper into his side with glided ease, and smiled at her charmingly. He looked like he was about to eat her. "Might you join me for a spot of lunch?" She would rather drink pubertuba pus. Hermione replied instead, I actually need to be getting back to my desk." That wasn't a request. Hermione had the distressed understanding of how a lone gazelle must feel during an hyena attack, like in the nature documentary she watched with her parents last Christmas, as she sat opposite Theo in the restaurant. It was sorely clear to Hermione that this restaurant catered to a particular clientele. The menu had no visible prices next to their items, a glaring red flag that would have had Hermione quickly escaping to the exit had she come alone. Judging by the haughty look the matron gave Hermione's attire upon their entrance, there was clearly a dress code, one that Hermione would likely never successfully abide by, even with the best efforts, despite it being luncheon hours, and their napkins were actually embroidered with golden silk. Hermione was genuinely concerned that if she touched the silver cutlery, it would repel away like one of those barbaric anti-Muggle-born repellent charms she had read about in her 4th year. "I don't know what Draco's been fussing about. It took absolutely no effort at all getting you to come for lunch," Theo said as he boldly flipped through the menu. Hermione's tongue flicked against her teeth, the hackles on the back of her neck once again bristling with agitation. She should have just run away on the street earlier. Long limbs aside, no doubt the crushing weight of his ego would have slowed him down. He peered at her over the menu, his eyes glittering with mirth, and he hummed, "Or perhaps you were just waiting for a different and much more handsome wizard to invite you out instead. What say you, Hermione?" He leaned in with a lethal smirk and whispered conspiratorially, "Shall I ditch my darling fiancé the same way you did Draco, and you and I can fly off into the sunset together?" "I didn't ditch Draco," she snapped. "Au contraire, my little lamb," he cooed. "You were always the brains of your little ménage à trois at school, so I'm sure you're well aware of the social etiquette that dictates that when somebody tells you that they love you, it's only proper to say back." Theo gestured for the waitress to come over, and Hermione swallowed miserably, not even bothering to protest when he ordered on her behalf, without even asking what she wanted, as she picked at the silk thread of her napkin next to her cutlery. "That day in the ministry," she said, deciding to cut straight to the chase after the waitress left, her eyes still boring holes into the table. "You were hoping I'd cotton on, about Draco and I, about the truth." Her tone wasn't accusing, but whether by tact or self-preservation, Theo chose not to respond all the same, only staring at her, his expression a cool, perfect mask as he waited for her to continue, but his eyes sparkled with the faintest hint of smug satisfaction. He and Pansy must have been scheming together since that day that she had received the invitation. Her name in royal navy blue silk flashed in her mind again. The couple that sticks their noses into other people's business together stays together, Hermione inwardly huffed. Her mind rushed to relay their meeting in the lift, an encounter that had seemingly been barely a blimp to Hermione at that time, but was now poignant in hindsight. She absent-mindedly wondered how many more memories she would one day look back on and notice all of the little details that had passed her by. Hermione brought her focus back to Theo and looked at him cautiously. "You said Draco is possessive over what is his," she began, watching his face carefully. He had an infuriatingly decent poker face. He didn't so much as blink. "Does Draco want to possess me?" "You are aware of his Latin origins of his name, no?" Theo drawled and cocked an eyebrow. "It's in a dragon's nature to covet the things most precious to them." Hermione's cheeks heated under a serpent-like, pointed look, yet something pleasant warmed her chest at the idea of Draco finding her precious. "Besides, from what I've witnessed, you've more than enjoyed reaping the benefits of Draco's affection for the past year." The warm fuzziness in her chest quickly evaporated, replaced with something much more bitter and thick with guilt. She didn't even bother to defend herself. That unpleasant encounter with Pansy the other week still sore in her memory. "I'm trying to make things right," she whispered into her lap. "Do tell." "I sent him food." There was a dry pause. "Romantic?" Theo panned eventually. Hermione's neck snapped up, her chest flaring defensively as she practically hissed, "It is!" A few alarmed patrons at a nearby table glanced over at her, and Hermione's ears flushed hotly at the disproving whispers the old witches murmured to each other as they got up, promptly moving to a table further across the restaurant. She leaned back into her seat and took a deep breath in an attempt to soothe the irritation curling in her stomach. "It's our thing," she explained. "When I met with Mrs. Malfoy, she taught me to think about something that was special for us. Cooking together. It's our thing." "You met Narcissa?" Theo's poised and indifferent mask slipped, and Hermione took great satisfaction from his flabbergasted expression. His eyes narrowed suspiciously. "When?" "The other day at his manor, when I went over there to tell Draco that when I went to find Draco." Time seemed endless under Theo's scrutinizing gaze, and Hermione had to sit on her hands to resist the urge to fidget with the napkin again. "Pansy said that you love him." She scowled. This was why Hermione hated gossip. Honestly, was nothing private anymore? As if sensing her thoughts, Theo smirked, his eyebrow cocked in amusement. "Not only is Pansy my loving, adoring fiancé, but we are both his best friends. Of course she told me all about your little burly talk. And there's no privacy amongst couples anyway. Oh, thank you, my love." He nodded to the waitress, who had appeared with their order. Hermione blinked, surprised at how quickly the food arrived. But given how the prices had been hidden on the menu, she suspected quick and efficient service was part of the experience. And bill. An admittedly divine-looking salmon fillet was placed in front of her, and she thanked the waitress quietly. Hermione rolled her eyes at the dashing wink Theo sent to the now blushing waitress, and she waited until the girl was safely out of earshot before she responded. "Everyone is entitled to their privacy, even married couples," she said, and petulantly shoved a forkful of salmon into her mouth. Thankfully, there hadn't been a repellent charm after all, and her eyes almost rolled into the back of her head. Great Circe! It all but melted on her tongue. She wondered if she and Draco might try replicating it. "Is that why you never told Draco that you love him?" Theo interrupted her thoughts as he leisurely carved into his filet mignon. Hermione had not been surprised in the slightest that he ordered the most premium cut. "Because of your adorable, naive little muggle belief that you shouldn't be honest with the person you love." "Draco never told me either," she bit back. "Maybe not in so many words, but certainly through other actions. His feelings for you have always been there. You've just not wanted to see it." "You sound like Parkinson," she said. "If this lunch is just an excuse for you to sit here and tell how poisonous I am for Draco, you can save your breath. Your adoring fiancé has already told me all about how much the two of you hate Draco and I being together. You even wanted him to quit his job to get him away from me." Theo had the nerve to smirk, and his eyes glittered fondly, as if they were simply regaling their youthful adventures at school. As if they weren't currently talking about Draco's best friend hating the woman that he hopefully still loved. "Oh, I wouldn't take any of that to heart, little lamb. Pansy does have quite the flair for the dramatics." He flicked his brows, the edge of his lips carved into a lascivious smirk, whilst his hand twirled the fork towards his mouth. His teeth slowly pulled on the fork, and the grating sound of the metal being scraped made Hermione's spine tense. She clenched around her own utensils tightly. She refused to give the smarmy sot the satisfaction of seeing her wince. "Well, thank Merlin you're above all that," she quipped dryly. Theo's grin was sharkish and biting. Now, Hermione, let's play nicely. Despite your ruthless stabbing my best friend in the heart, I found myself growing rather fond of you recently." He tilted his head and pouted. "It would be quite a shame to have to say goodbye to our monthly foursome dinners," he added belatedly, smirking when a passing waiter, overhearing their conversation, gawked at them. Hermione's cheeks colored under the waiter's scandalized stares, and she glared at Theo loathingly, who snickered at her. "Such attitude, little lamb. Let's hope that you cook better than you socialize. Otherwise, you're never going to win Draco back, relying on that horrendous personality of yours." "I thought you were growing fond of me." Her voice was thick with saccharine sweetness. "Like draught of the living death, you're tolerable in small dosages." Hermione curled her lip, shoving a piece of asparagus into her mouth, bitterly. His words about Draco set like iron in her stomach, and it took her several attempts to swallow, her throat full with anxiety. She still hadn't heard anything from Draco, and she couldn't ignore the suffocating, consuming fear that maybe she had been too late. "I want him back, Nott," she whispered into her plate, squeezing her eyes shut to force back her tears. She would rather face off with Greyback than to cry in front of Theo. "I do love him. I want to spend the rest of my life with him." And as soon as she spoke those words out loud, the consuming and overwhelming sincerity of them struck her like a bludgeon. She already knew she wanted him, but she wanted so much more. She wanted to witness his every morning. She wanted to kiss his wrinkles as they aged. She wanted to find out their children's names. She wanted to argue with him about their children's names. She wanted to argue with him on her magical theories every day for the rest of her life. She just wanted to be with him. Hermione flushed, slightly mortified by her heavy honesty. It was only lunchtime after all. Perhaps she did need to take an etiquette class. Theo simply stared at her for several long moments, his eyes distant as he evidently became lost in his own thoughts. Eventually his expression cleared, and he shrugged dismissively and turned back to his plate. "Trust me on this, Granger. Draco's never been one for grand gestures." Theo looked up at her from carving his steak, his eyes dark and glittering with determination, and was that satisfaction? Whatever it was, Hermione had the distinct idea that she had just earned Theo's acceptance. She was surprised at the flicker of relief that passed through her chest. "If you love him, just tell him," Theo said, effectively ending the discussion. As Hermione let his words sink in, and she finished her glorious salmon fillet, Theo turned the conversation over to wedding plans, much to her chagrin, and spent the next 15 minutes dramatically retelling the story of how offended he had been when the wedding planner had the gall to suggest a violet color theme for their after-party. How dare the wedding planner not know that neither Pansy nor Theo were light summers? As Hermione made the mental note to ensure that she sent them a congratulatory bouquet of violets on their wedding day, Theo pondered out loud over whether the wedding champagne should be Chardonnay or Pinot Grigio. "Personally, I have quite a sweet tooth, so I would prefer that of a more citrus body. But Pansy is of the opinion that a winter wedding should be accompanied by dry wine. And since we're having a Pinot Grigio at the engagement party... Oh, I do hope you make an appearance, little lamb. Mrs. Malfoy's dress robes never miss. Where was I? Oh, yes. Since we're having the Pinot Grigio then, it would apparently be in poor taste to have our guests drink it at the wedding as well." Theo continued on, and Hermione had to concentrate very intensely on the flavors dancing in her mouth to fight back her heavy, bored sigh. And yet, as bitingly annoying as the couple could be, whilst Theo then went on to offer up more appropriate hairstyles for Hermione for their special day. "As adorable as your dog fur coat is," he mockingly assured her. She couldn't help but think that Pansy and Theo were made for each other. Crookshanks had been glaring at her all evening. "Yes, I know, you're not the only one who misses him. I'm working on it," she eventually snapped at him, after his chest rumbled with a growl for the 4th time. Hermione had dared to sit in Draco's spot on the couch. It was one of the few spots in her flat that still had traces of his cologne lingering in the fabric, and this had evidently offended her cat greatly. Her calf still stung from his clawed protest. Crookshank's chin cocked towards the ceiling, and he haughtily prowled across the living room and leapt up onto the ottoman. He circled around on a plush cushion several times before plonking down flat, his sourly eyes barely visible as he continued to glare at her, unimpressed. Hermione huffed. Maybe Draco had been right. Perhaps her cat was a lustful Crooks. Hermione turned her back on the fur-balled demon and looked back at the letter set in her lap. "Dear Miss Granger, we are pleased to confirm that your consultation with Mind Healer Ree has been arranged for you on the 7th of June, 2006. Please report to the reception upon arrival. Our office is located on the 7th floor." Hermione exhaled slowly, folding the letter back into its envelope once she had committed its contents to memory. She let her back sink into the cushions, surprised at how weightless she felt. Already there was a calmness to her. It ebbed like a gentle tide over her skin, and she basked in its soothing comfort. Hermione hadn't felt like this since she had last fallen asleep in Draco's arms. For the first time in a month, Hermione didn't find it difficult to breathe. Gelfling the Goblin was an arrogant little sot. From the moment he had sauntered into her office and cocked his feet up onto the edge of her desk, granted he had to move the chair barely a hair's distance away to reach, he'd made it very clear to Hermione that he was doing her a favor by being here. Coming to her office to discuss his own complaint, Hermione definitely needed to recommend Madley for a raise. Her assistant mercifully had had the foresight to only schedule a 30-minute slot for his meeting. She snuck a glance at her clock on the wall. Only 90 seconds to go. Mr. Gelfling had spent the last good 28, almost 29, minutes of their meeting disparaging the modest works of wizarding metalsmiths, how, even with their precious wizarding charms, their skill would never amount to that of the born-blessed goblin, and that only a goblin had the right to hold the prestigious title of a Gringotts banker. After all, no witch or wizard could ever have the intelligence or efficiency to handle the tasks needed of a banker. She had been sorely tempted to ask him if he had been employed at Gringotts during their break-in 8 years ago. 55 more seconds to go.
Truth be told, Miss Granger, I do hold some concerns about your capabilities to handle my case.
Hermione raised an eyebrow before she sent him a questioning, tight smile. I beg your pardon? Mr. Gelfling eyed the stacks of paperwork around her desk, disdain curling his lip.
I do not believe that you have the efficiency in place to commit 100% of your time to me.
20 seconds to go. His beady black eyes pierced through hers.
Perhaps I would be better off contacting the head of the department directly. He certainly knows how to focus his time towards his goals.
His legs kicked off the table, and a small stack of papers toppled over onto the floor. He didn't even spare them a second glance. 8 seconds to go.
And of course, I'm sure that in the future you will have other commitments, as a woman of your age typically does. I'm sure you can understand why I would prefer to have my case handled by a more focused wizard.
He smirked with a pointed look at her flat stomach. She couldn't hold back her glare of utter loathing. A quick flicker to her clock, and she turned back to him, a faint apologetic expression on her face. I'm afraid our time is up. You can speak with our receptionist on the way out to discuss rearranging the handle of your complaint, Mr. Gelfling. He straightened his waistcoat, a heavy sigh falling from his mouth, as a spiteful hand flicked at a spare quill that had been hovering over the edge of the desk, causing it to fall to the floor on top of her files. Mr. Gelfling smirked and wriggled his fingers and turned to waddle out of her office with nary goodbye. A small blessing, she guessed, and bent down to crouch in her footwell to collect her fallen paperwork. A light tap on her door, and she saw Madley's heels enter her office from underneath her desk.
Miss Granger?
Her assistant asked, no doubt perplexed at seeing a seemingly empty office. Under here, she called, and rubbed her knuckles on the wood.
There you are. Your next meeting is in 10 minutes, with the lady who is refusing to close down her Sphinx breeding farm.
Oh, yes, thank you, Laura. Is that all? She reached for a quill, her knees grinding somewhat painfully against her worn-in carpet.
Yes, that's... Oh, wait, no. I thought you'd like to know Mr. Malfoy's in his office. He came in about 20 minutes ago.
Hermione jumped and let out a string of curses as her head thwacked against the top of her desk harshly. A hand nursing the top of her head, she awkwardly scrambled out from under her desk and peered at Madley. She was very aware of how her eyes bulged out of her head. He's what? She rasped out. Madley's lips twitched, and she had to turn and cough pointedly to hold back a visible laugh.
Yes, he's returned not long ago. Miss Granger?
Hermione leapt from behind her desk and strode towards the door of her office, her adrenaline and trepidation being the only thing that stopped her from toppling over. Her vision was dotting rather alarmingly.
Miss Granger, what about your meeting?
Cancel it.
Cancel? But we've received word from the main desk your client is already on.
I don't have time right now, she hissed over her shoulder and stalked her way down the corridor towards his office, towards him. His office door was open, and Hermione's heart throbbed against her chest. A pit bloomed in her stomach. What if he had already left? If she had missed him because she was in a stupid, worthless meeting with that hubristic goblin? Well, she supposed she could always accidentally set his case folder on fire. His doorway was barely a couple of feet away from her now, and her chest quivered, her nose burning as she fought back the suffocating fear that he had not left. Hermione exhaled silently, and she had to grasp onto the door frame so that her knees didn't buckle towards the floor. Her mind was positively dizzy from how her relief oozed through every muscle in her body. That, and she'd potentially given herself a concussion. Sweet Circe. She had forgotten how broad his shoulders were. Her thighs squeezed together at the way that his white shirt stretched across his back, and her teeth gnawed on her bottom lip. It was almost indecent how sexy he looked in his office attire. He had his back to the door, seemingly organizing something into a manila folder. His briefcase had perched open and waiting on his desk, next to dozens of scattered folders, next to Hermione's brain short-circuited. His hydrangeas, still as freshly bloomed and blushed pink as the day she had given them to him. Her eyes stung with tears, and she swallowed thickly, forcing back down the relieved whimper in her throat. He had kept the flowers, and he still hadn't noticed her in the doorway. She licked her lips, butterflies fluttering up in a storm in her stomach, and called out softly, "You're back." Draco's head snapped up, and he whipped around on his heel. Hermione couldn't stop her shoulders from melting when his eyes met hers, and her blood hummed in her ears. It was like her entire body rejuvenated under his attention. Her lungs no longer felt tight and compressed as she stood fixed under his gaze. It really was difficult to breathe without him. Draco's eyes flickered, only for a moment, before his expression shuttered closed, and he looked back down at the folder on his desk, his jaw clenched firmly. He looked like he was trying to pretend that she wasn't there. The butterflies fell into the reopened pit of her stomach. "I'm just here to pick up some files." His voice was detached, empty like his expression. Hermione wasn't sure which one she hated more. "Oh," she swallowed thickly, forcing down the panic nausea that had lodged in her throat. He was leaving again. "If you love him, just tell him." Should she just blurt it out? Was that something a person just did? Just spit out their feelings for someone? Maybe she should storm over to his desk. Maybe grab him by the collar, tuck under his silken locks of his, and give him the snog of his life. "How is Cumbria?" she asked instead. "Long," was all he replied before he walked behind the desk. Like it was a shield. Like he needed some form of barrier between them, a barrier against her. And yet he's kept his hydrangeas, she thought, with a hopeful twinge in her chest. Draco did not so much as glance in her direction as he read over the labels on his folders. She huffed, sour irritation furling in her stomach. She had almost forgotten how stubborn he could be. Merlin, could he not even look her in the eye anymore? Hermione tore her eyes away from him. His refusal to peel his gaze away from these bloody folders was like knives piercing every nerve in her body. Her eyes landed on the calendar on the wall, and she breathed out a laugh. What a timing she had. "Happy birthday, Draco." That got his attention, but the pained tightness of his face told her that maybe that had been the wrong thing to say. He just stared at her. She stared right back. Silence stretched between the pair. "If you love him, just tell him." Hermione licked her lips nervously, the words bubbling in her chest. She could do this. She had been thinking it for days now. She had said it through her gifts, through her biscuits, through her words. She could tell him. "You didn't reply to my note." Well, that was a start. A fleeting frown marred his brows. "I didn't think you wanted me to. You made your point very clear, Granger." Draco looked back down at his desk. His laugh was bitter, icy. Hermione didn't think her heart could hurt more. Wait, what point had she made? Hermione frowned back at him, his features going out of focus as she thought back to what she wrote. "Take care of yourself." Her face went cold, the blood promptly draining away as she realized the connotations of her message. He hadn't thought of a mangy, damp corner of the Hogwarts library. He hadn't thought of a simple act of compassion during their darkest times. He had thought she was saying goodbye. No, 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 no. Panic weaved through her spine, and she opened her mouth. Her jaw practically vibrated with the words she was dying to tell him, that she needed to tell him. "No, Draco, that's not—" "You did not have to do all of that with the food." Draco beat her to it, his fingers tracing elegant nondescript patterns over his folder. Hermione never thought that she would be jealous of a piece of manila card, and yet it was never ploy or anything, he continued, a wistful, bitter smile etched at his lips. And he still wasn't looking at her. "I liked cooking for you. It just gave me some peace of mind. I liked knowing that you needed me. I know that Pansy came to see you, and I know what she said, but it was never like that." He shrugged. "I didn't care that my affections were one-sided." Hermione's never twisted mournfully, but it wasn't one-sided. She needed to tell him. He looked up at her again, and her words died in her chest, smothered by the butterflies that bloomed under the faint, but still there, warmth in his eyes. Oh, how she missed that smile. Oh, how she missed him. How she loved him. Granger, I don't want you to feel like you have to pay that back somehow. I told you I'd accept your answer, no matter what. You don't. If you feel guilty, that's not what. He trailed off, and her heart clenched at the forlorn and lost expression on his face. The same expression he had when she had begged him to stay, when Crookshanks was ill. How he didn't want to take advantage of her. How she'd been afraid of taking advantage of him. She loved him so much. Draco's eyes stared determinedly, a jarring contrast to the open, raw honesty of his face. He had never looked so beautiful. I'm leaving you alone, Hermione. If I can't have you in this life, I can wait to try again in our next one. A pitiful whimper escaped her lips, and her knees sagged from his words. As romantic and all-consuming as his vow was, the idea of having to wait decades, maybe even centuries, to be in his arms again, of waiting until the next life, Hermione wasn't even sure if she believed in such a thing, to feel his morning kisses against her neck, to have to wait to see that beautiful private smile of his again, to have to spend the rest of her days in this life alone, in her concrete, empty bed, to not have him tease her about her inked freckles, to not have him tug at her plate when her posture hunched a little too much, to not have him, right now, to have him thinking for the rest of his life that she didn't love him back. Hermione shook her head, her chest acidic and twisting in despaired protest. Her eyes stung with salty tears, and she choked on a sob. Maybe she was selfish. Maybe she didn't deserve him, but she was damned if she lived one more day letting Draco believe that she didn't love him. I don't want that, she blurted out, and rushed to continue after seeing his face drop in resignation. Merlin, would she ever not put her foot in her mouth? I don't want to wait. Draco's lips dropped open softly, and he looked at her hesitantly, his eyes rich with disbelief, yet a small flickering light of hope, and Hermione breathed in deeply. And this time her words didn't fail her. I want you, Draco, in this lifetime. I want to trip over your Quidditch jersey. I want to buy your nasty ice cream every week. I want to fill our flat with your family antiques, because it's your home too. It's always been your home too. I want to listen to you argue with our cat every morning. And I want you to make extra slices of toast, because he's stolen yours from you, and well, you really need to improve your toast-making skills. I want to go to Quidditch games with you. Not that I give a damn about your team, but you're so happy when they've won, and I'm selfish because I want to be there to see you so happy. I want you to prove to me how wrong my potion theories are, even though you know I'm right, and I want to see a family library. I want to walk with you in your beautiful family conservatory and hear about your childhood adventures. I want our Friday dinners back. I want to buy you every type of flower there is, because, well, you're breathtaking when you blush. I want to know our children's names. Merlin, I want to know our grandchildren's names. Hermione paused, her chest trembling, her throat burning with acid as she forced down another sob. I want you, Draco. I've always wanted you. I wanted to tell you that day in my office, and you didn't, and I know I couldn't. You know, for someone who said he had all the time in the world to wait, you didn't give me very long to answer, you prick. She crossed her arms petulantly, her lips dropping into a pout. Draco stared at her. His face flitted between disbelief, wonder, delight, and then disbelief again, and he shook his head, his eyes wide and childlike in their vulnerability, like he didn't believe her, like he didn't want to believe her. Hermione pulled herself toward and held his gaze determinedly. I want to do all of those things because I love you. It was Draco's turn to shudder on an exhale. He breathed like a man inhaling his first breath after being trapped underwater. His expression was pinched and his eyes clenched shut in a wince. He shook his head. Don't. He paused to clear his throat, his voice hoarse and strained. Don't say that just because I said it. And it was like her heart broke once more. But I do love you, she said softly, before the flames of determination fired up once more in her chest, and she pulled her wand from her holster, gritting her teeth as she conjured up a red tulip to appear on his desk. A red tulip for perfect love, like what we have. Another wave of her wand. A peony. In some cultures, the name for most beautiful translates to peony. You're my peony. A third wave of her wand. Sunflowers, for adoration and loyalty. I absolutely adore you, Draco. Draco's cheeks were positively flushed, his eyes lost in awe and disbelief as she waved her wand again and again and again. Gladiolus. White orchids, hyacinth, roses, dozens of flowers sprang onto his desk, the one moving in a continuous blur until she could no longer see the folders, buried under a rainbow of petals. The folders that threatened to take him away from her. She paused, sweat wetting at her hairline, and she panted breathlessly. At some points tears had streamed down her cheeks, and she looked at him, a broken, pleading whimper at the edge of her lips. I love you, Draco. I'm sorry. I'm sorry it took me so long to say, but it's true. I love you. I'll say it every day for the rest of our lives, if that is what it takes for you to believe me. I love you. She licked her lips, a tingle at the back of her neck, as his eyes, now hot and blown wide, traced the movement. You once told me that I was like in your skin. Well, you're my oxygen. She smiled weakly at him, her heart raging, twisting fiend against her ribcage. I can't breathe without you, Draco. Draco's chest heaved, and he swallowed thickly, his expression dazed and blown, like she'd clipped him over the head. I love you, she said. His eyes were now dark and fixed like a viper as he edged the corner of his desk. I love you, she repeated. He was in front of his desk now, his jaw tight with determination as he strode towards her. Every cell in her body hummed and throbbed in anticipation. I love you, I love you, I love you. She was like a broken record, repeating it with every step he took, repeating it for every denial, every rejection she'd ever made. Every time she had thought it, repeated it until he was a breath's distance away from her, and his hands cupped her cheeks fiercely. She thought she might collapse if he let go of her. I love you. Draco's eyes glittered, a mix of awe, triumph, and sheer happiness. She took back what she thought earlier. There, now, in this moment, he had never looked more beautiful. Once more. Say it again, he said, and the gravelled vibrations of his voice made her knees quiver. His cologne was intoxicating, gliding and weaving through every pore of her skin. Every spare inch of her was encased with him. Hermione sighed happily, positively drunk from his touch. I love you, Draco Malfoy. A thumb gently swept away the lingering tears on her cheeks, and his forehead pressed against hers, his whole body sagging in relief. Her heart sang in her chest, her trembling hands reaching up to stroke along the edge of his jaw. She needed to touch him. She needed to know that it was real. She needed him to know that this was real, that they were real. His nose nudged hers, and her navel quivered and hummed in delight as his breath danced across her lips. Hermione, she hummed, and her eyes fluttered close as she tilted her chin up slowly to his. There's nothing wrong with how I make toast. Her eyes flew open, meeting the teasing glint of his own gaze. She puffed out a laugh, a hand coming down to smack lightly on his chest. Git? Draco's lips curved into that beautiful private smile, and Hermione's reached nirvana. I love you too, Granger, he murmured, and tilted his head down, Hermione's entire body an exposed laugh wire in anticipation, his lips swooping to meet hers.
Mr. Malfoy, your portkey is ready to... Oh, Merlin's beard!
They sprang apart. Hermione whipped around to see Thomas Diggle pointedly staring at the floor. His ears and neck flushed something horrendous, and his knuckles were white as he gripped the doorknob fiercely.
Shit,
Thomas spluttered, his cheeks pale with mortification, and was that fear? Hermione looked back at Draco, and she had to bite down on her lip to suppress her chuckle. He looked murderous. What is it, Diggle? Draco spat his name like it was a curse.
Your portkey is ready, sir. Your portkey is ready, sir.
Draco looked back down at Hermione, his eyes hot and steeled with intent. Give me 10 minutes, he said, his eyes focused on her lips, and they flashed darkly when she shivered. Maybe they could make it 20 minutes.
Yeah, I'm sorry, sir, but there was a delay in getting it sent to the department. It leaves in 5 minutes. I'm sorry, sir.
Thomas apologized, and Hermione couldn't tell if he was apologizing for the department's error or interrupting. Probably the latter, judging by the utter venom in Draco's sneer, and Hermione snorted. She looked back at Thomas. The poor boy looked like he was seconds away from dropping to his knees and pleading for his life. It's all right, Thomas. He'll be right there. She appeased the tension in the air, and her lips twitched when Draco huffed indignantly behind her. Thomas nodded, clearly not waiting for Draco to protest otherwise, as he darted from the office. Hermione turned and placed a placating hand on Draco's elbow, peering up at him from under her lashes, and grinned wryly. Looks like you're the one who doesn't have any time, Mr. Malfoy, she teased, even as her chest curled in sour dissatisfaction at the thought of having to watch him leave. Draco blinked at her. He blinked again, and then his chest shuddered on a breathless laugh of disbelief. Hermione let out a laugh of her own before her eyes dropped to his lips. Her lids felt heavy, her eyes hazy, and she lifted onto her tiptoes, tilted her chin to meet his lips, to meet the air as Draco jerked out of reach. Hermione faltered, hurt and confusion marrying her brows into a frown. Draco smiled, equal parts amusement and want dancing in his eyes, as he shook his head softly. If I try to kiss you goodbye, I'm not pulling away until you're screaming with your legs wrapped around my waist, Draco said huskily, and wisely took a step away from her, yet his arm still twitched towards her in protest. I really do need to catch that portkey. Hermione bit down on her lip, peering over his shoulder to stare at his completely flower-covered, perhaps she went a tad overboard, desk contemplatively. Maybe if they were really quick. Don't even think about it, Granger, Draco groaned, and turned to his desk to dig through the forest of petals, eventually pulling out those blasted folders. Hermione must have looked as sulky as she felt, because he looked back at her and smirked. His eyes practically twinkled in delight. I've waited a very long time for you, Hermione, he purred, stepping in closely once more to tuck lightly on her plate. His lips twitched fondly. I can wait a couple more days. She huffed. Just because they could didn't mean that they had to. Of course, she didn't say that out loud. She knew he was right. He did have to leave. As much as it pained her to agree with him, he had a job to do. No matter how much she wanted to leap into his arms and snap the living daylight out of him. Instead, she stepped forward to close the distance between them, and she reached up to fix the crisp collar of his shirt. She smiled when his arm snaked around her waist subconsciously. Hurry up and come back, Draco. She stared, transfixed on his lips. She looked up and flicked her brow, her lips tugging into another grin. I believe I owe you a coffee. He gazed down at her, and his smile was magnificent. Thank you for listening to today's chapter of Once More with Feelin by Wetpretzel, read by Alex Marbella. If you would like to stay up to date on upcoming chapters and stories, you can follow me on AO3, YouTube, or Tumblr. Thank you to Wetpretzel for letting me read their story, and thank you to all of you for listening.